Well, I'm back. I'm so sorry for the delay. I was sick. I had a lot of obligations going on, and things were just supremely, deeply chaotic slash depression slash bronchitis. It was a lot, and I'm so sorry about that delay. I am working to make sure that there are no more long delays between videos like that again on the main channel. But if you follow me on Patreon or Nebula, I did have some content over there to kind of keep things going a little bit while I was in recovery. For July, I put up a poll to see what video my patrons would want to have been the video for July. Due to delays, I didn't get it up for July, but the results were very clear, and the answer was true crime. So here we are, talking about something very depressing and sad, and I read several books on this topic, so it was definitely a labor of love. If any of that is of any interest to you, please keep watching, and if you like what I do, please subscribe and press the notification bell, because even though it's a silly call to action, it actually helps, because I found out through my statistics, through that creator homepage that shames me every time a video underperforms. They're like, the bell's not ringing, and I'm like, well, maybe if you just, subscription should just be the bell. Why did you make it harder? Content warning, we are going to be talking very candidly about murder, but it is not going to be voyeuristic, and I will be giving a lot of suggestions and notes. Any books, articles that I mention or bring up will all be listed down below, and if you do follow me on Nebula, there will be an extended cut on that site after this video with a few more case studies that I wanted to bring up, but were a little bit extraneous in this video. So if you like this and you want to see more of it, check it out on Nebula. But let's go. If you ask any fan of true crime what crime or case was their entry point into this bloody, problematic world, they can give you all the details. For many of my generation and right above, some famous true crime cases you will see mentioned are the murder of John Benet Ramsey, the O.J. Simpson's trial, the incidents of Waco and Ruby Ridge, and the Tate LaBlanca murders for those of us old Hollywood stans. Mine is the murder of Meredith Kritcher, also known as the Amanda Knox case. I was still in high school, I believe, when I first saw the 2020 episode special about Amanda Knox, the 20-year-old from Seattle who was accused of murdering her roommate, Meredith, while she was studying abroad in Italy, and spent almost 4 years in an Italian prison. As I watched the 2020 documentary on Knox's case, I was shocked and horrified that there was no DNA evidence against her, and that most of the factors leading towards her guilt were questionable behavior, aka kissing her boyfriend and acting weird.
They came up with a whole theory about a sex game that I orchestrated that ended in Meredith's murder.
Acting weird is held against a lot of people, even though that is not actually a crime. But yeah, don't act weird under any circumstances when the police are around. One of many tips you'll get throughout this video. Eventually, DNA evidence exonerated Knox, and then in 2015, Knox was acquitted by the Italian Supreme Court, which is amazing. But that has not stopped her horrible experience being picked apart by Twitter trolls every time she makes a comment, and Matt Damon movies. It's just like, leave her alone, you guys. She's innocent. She's innocent. By a court of law, innocent. As a Black woman in America, it never was a secret to me that the legal system has never been our friend, but the idea that a whole ass white woman could be ripped to shreds by the British and Italian media with such little evidence really shook me. And ever since then, I kind of knew that the legal system is not your friend. If you are vulnerable, it will go after you, despite everything. If someone like Amanda Knox is not safe from being railroaded, then who is? True crime, despite seemingly very popular now, has always been popular and macabre. Hangings and public executions were well photographed events that were often used as an extension of the whole breads and circuses spectacle. It was bloody, it was violent, it was seen as a deterrent to crime. Charles Dickens, yes, that Charles Dickens, wrote that on November 13th, 1849, a crowd of over 30,000 people gathered outside a prison in South London to witness the public hanging of Marie and Frederick Manning. It was the first time a husband and wife had been executed together in England since 1700. So they were like, girl, it only happens one in this generation, you gotta bring it back, bring it back. It was on tour. It basically looks like pictures from Lollapalooza. It was like, I was like 6 feet apart, y'all, 6 feet apart. In a letter to the Times describing the horrific details, Dickens said the following: morning.
Sir, I was a witness of the execution at Horsemonger Lane this morning. I went there with the intention of observing the crowd gathered to behold it, and I had excellent opportunities of doing so at intervals all throughout the night and continuously from daybreak until after the spectacle was over. I believe that a sight so inconceivably awful as the wickedness and levity of the immense crowd collected at that execution this morning could be imagined by no man and could be presented in no heathen land under the sun. The horrors of the gibbet and of the crime which brought this wretched murderers to it faded in my mind before the atrocious bearing, looks, and language of the assembled spectators. When I came upon the scene at midnight, the shrillness of the cries and howls that were raised from time to time, denoting that they came from a concourse of boys and girls already assembled in the best places, made my blood run cold. As the night went on, screeching and laughing and yelling in strong chorus of parodies on Negro melodies, with substitutions of Mrs. Manning for Susanna and the like, were added to these. When the day dawned, thieves, low prostitutes, ruffians, and vagabonds of every kind flocked onto the ground with every variety of offensive and foul behavior. Fightings, faintings, whistlings, imitations of punch, brutal jokes, tumultuous demonstrations of indecent delight when swooning women were dragged out of the crowd by the police with their dresses disordered, gave a new zest to the general entertainment. When the sun rose brightly, as it did, it gilded thousands upon thousands of upturned faces, so inexpressibly odious in their brutal mirth or callousness, that a man had cause to feel ashamed of the shape he wore, and to shrink from himself as fashioned in the image of the devil. When the two miserable creatures who attracted all this ghastly sight about them were turned quivering into the air, there was no more emotion, no more pity. No more thought that two immortal souls had gone to judgment, no more restraint in any of the previous obscenities than if the name of Christ had never been heard in this world, and there was no belief among men but that they perished like the beasts. I am solemnly convinced that nothing that ingenuity could devise to be done in this city, in the same compass of time, could work such ruin as one public execution, and I stand astounded and appalled by the wickedness it exhibits. I do not believe that any community can prosper where such a scene of horror and demoralization as was enacted this morning outside Horsemonger Lane Jail is presented at the very doors of good citizens and is passed by, unknown or forgotten.
The state-sanctioned murder of two people is being used as a warning sign to those in the audience. But what does any of that true crime spectacle mean if you don't interrogate the reasons why criminals exist? More so, do these massive spectacles actually teach people to respect the sanity of life or stay away from the criminal element? I, and many abolitionists, would argue no. And I think that if you listen to true crime, you should kind of pick it up on your own. It is my belief, and the thesis of this entire video, that true crime, if consumed critically, asks the consumer to be critical of the criminal justice system, aware of the corruption, biases, and failures of the police state, and to realize that the prison industrial complex is not actually protecting us the way that we think that it should. In this video, we're going to talk about the lessons that can be learned about our criminal justice system from true crime stories. But first, a word from our sponsors. This video is sponsored by the lovely members of my Patreon and by Brilliant. Brilliant is a learning site that features problems and courses in mathematics, physics, quantitative finance, and computer science. Through its courses, it allows you to build quantitative skills in math, science, and computer science with fun and challenging interactive explorations. It allows you to start as either a beginner or refresh your knowledge in a number of activities that are invested in you organically learning at the pace that you are at, rather than the quick pace of the classroom. As someone who has always struggled with math and science, the biggest obstacles were feeling as if there was such a rush to get through the material that I couldn't actually ever grasp what was in front of me. Every time I was just getting a handle on something, we would move on to something else, and I would feel as if all of the previous stuff just kind of like left my brain, like invisible numbers, I was like, I don't even understand you. Negative numbers, why? I am familiar with those from my bank account, but still. It was something that I always felt insecure about because A, immigrant parents love it when you're good at math and science, and B, I always had an interest in science. I also had an interest in these topics. I think of math can be a really fun puzzle at times. I do still like matrices, but I felt really bad that I could never actually study it the way I wanted to, and I just kind of ignored it. And that is why I'm really happy to be sponsored by Brilliant and being able to offer you all 20% off their yearly subscription if you use my URL. Learning should be accessible, and the older I get, the more excited I am about being able to learn at my own pace, in my own way, and Brilliant allows you to do that for math and science without anyone shaming you or draining you by comparing you to your younger brother because he's so good at math. Love you, Bradley. So if you're interested, again, use my URL for 20% off and start getting, in the words of Finn, mathematical. Right now, the political hot potato is a discussion of the rise in crime. As The View's Meghan McCain loved to remind people every day while she was still a co-host on that show, people are afraid of the rising crime rates across the nation.
I wish that there was a little bit of energy coming from Democrats, particularly in Washington, D.C., where I'm at right now, about the violence going on and the homicide rate, because quite frankly, I have a higher likelihood of getting shot leaving this building than I do of getting COVID. From July 14th to 28th, there were 4 COVID deaths and 11 homicides in Washington, D.C. So again, there's a lot of problems and there's a lot of ways to die, but I wish that Democrats would care about that as well. You don't have to listen to me.
During the 2021 mayoral race in New York City, the front runner and eventual winner was Eric Adams, a black former cop who was running on as close to a law and order campaign as you could in the blue New York City. It ended up being a tight race towards the end with his 2 more progressive female opponents very close behind him, but he did win. And I think his win is a reminder of something really important. The same white New Yorkers that protested for George Floyd still want to live in a safe, gentrified city. And their politics, going to the left as far as possible, will always stop against that. And at the same time, black and brown people, while having a very complex relationship to the police, still want some sense of order in their lives and in their communities. There is something worth asking about: what does it mean to the average black or brown person to defund the police? And what does that mean for communities of color, both factually and how they feel? Because sometimes feelings do end up mattering more than facts when it comes to these discussions. According to the New Republic, overall data from Nationscape, which has over 19,000 black respondents, shows that about 44% of black respondents have a favorable opinion of the police, in contrast to the 71% of white respondents with a similar inclination. Despite having that unfavorable opinion on the police, the statistics also show that black Americans want a police presence in their neighborhood. When asked whether they want the police to spend more time, the same amount of time, or less time than they currently do in their area, most black Americans, 61%, want the police presence to remain the same. Note, black communities are already over-policed. This is similar to the 67% of all US adults preferring the status quo, including 71% of white Americans. Meanwhile, nearly equal proportions of black Americans say they would like the police to spend more time in their area, 20%, as they say they'd like them to spend less time there, 19%, while knowing it is likely to end up unwell, according to a Gallup poll on this subject. For many people, black people included, law and order is what they think will keep them safe. They've been taught that, and because things are getting safer and because gentrification is such a big thing, that all plays into the politics of major cities. Failed mayor candidate Andrew Yang made sure to fill his campaign with gentrifier dog whistles. While discussing the issues of homelessness, Yang recounted a story about a friend of his wife's that was punched in the face by a mentally ill man in Hell's Kitchen. And that incident is one of the elements of the changing character of New York City neighborhoods and forcing people to leave the city. The neighborhoods he mentions as having been changed are East Harlem, the Upper West Side, and the aforementioned Hell's Kitchen, 3 of the most expensive and gentrified areas in New York City. And this isn't even counting Brooklyn, which has its own gentrification issues and problems. Going back to defund the police, how exactly do the police fall into this? Defunding the police has become a slogan that is labeled as divisive by people who really inherently feel like having the police around makes things safer. Because it is apparently harder to recruit and police feel less supported, that is being blamed for crime going up. So let's first talk about the crime statistics that have everyone afraid and is part of the whole fear-mongering discussion around defund the police. Yes, it is spiking now because we are literally comparing it to a pre-pandemic year. But in general, crime is very much lower than it has ever been. The BBC reported that overall violent crime was up by about 3% in 2020 over the previous years, but this should be seen in the context of the larger term downward trend from a peak in the early 1990s. So yes, there has been a jump in crime, and that is something to be aware of. But if you're looking at the numbers, you're talking about a jump that is related to the fact that for the past 15 months, we have been living in a pandemic, which has led to massive job loss, increase in gun sales, and some of the most deeply economic instability we've ever had. It is not the best combination, and in a situation like that, of course, crime would raise. This is not something directly tied to policing. We have had police protests for years. This is not new. And again, yet these numbers are nowhere near as close to what crime was like in the 80s and 90s, which is what people are fearful of returning. This fear, however, runs contrary to the fact that crime is down and has been going down overwhelmingly for decades, especially the violent crime that people want the police to protect them from. According to Pew, property crime in the US is much more common than violent crime. In 2019, the FBI reported a total of 2,109.9, don't know where the point is from, property crimes per 100,000 people, compared with 379.4, again, don't know what the point is for, violent crimes per 100,000 people. Both the FBI and the Bureau of Justice Statistics data shows dramatic declines in US violent and property crime rates since the early 1990s, which is again the spike that everyone is afraid of. Despite that, no one actually seems to have a sense of that change. In 20 of 24 Gallup surveys conducted since 1993, at least 60% of US adults say that there has been more crime nationally than there was the year before, despite, and I repeat again, a national trend downward. We're doing really good as a nation when it comes to violent and property crimes. And there are a lot of factors to that. There's a lot of controversy and discussion about what has actually helped with crime rates lowering down. And it isn't actually tied to policing, which is very, very bitter. And it's not even drive next to prisons. It's like they don't really know what did it. It is up for debate. And if it's up for debate, that means that no one thing, especially not police officers, can take the credit for that. Now, you hear these lower rates and falling crime, and you would think that this means that the police are solving and clearing more cases because less of a caseload, right? No. Most crimes that are reported to the police are not solved. Based on an FBI measure known as the clearance rate, that is the share of cases each year that are closed or cleared through either the arrest and charging, the referral of a suspect for prosecution, or due to any exceptional circumstances, which includes the death of a suspect. So all those things include clearing, and of course, if a victim refuses to cooperate with the prosecution, that would also lead to a cleared case. So all of that can lead to a cleared case. And yet, in 2019, police nationwide cleared only 45.5% of violent crimes that were reported to them, and 17.2% of the property crimes that came to their attention. This means that the most common crime and the most likely crime to happen to a person, property crime, is rarely ever solved. Over 80% of the time, if someone steals your shit, that shit is gone. Get insurance. Get renter's insurance, homeowner's insurance, get that Apple everything, because if someone takes your shit is gone. Still more, honestly.
If you're not cheating, you're not trying. We lie, we cheat, we steal.
Within that 45%, murder and manslaughter gets cleared the highest, which is 61%. Great. Rape, 32.9%. What are we doing here? When people who believe in police reform and police abolition bring up their beliefs, the common response is, well, who's gonna stop rapes and protect people from murder? Well, the reality is people are not that protected. If you are raped, there is a 67% chance that your case will not be cleared. The best case clear situation is murder and manslaughter, when that is the thing that is least likely to happen to a person. So yeah, you get murdered, high chance it might get cleared, but you'll also be dead. And here's the thing, police officers have a hard job. And part of it is that they are asked to step into situations they are not trained or paid to be trained to do. The national average annual wage of a police officer is $67K, according to the BLS. It is a job that you can get without a lot of education that comes with a pension and benefits. It is a good blue-collar job that can elevate you more so into the middle class bracket. That's why many black officers became cops. Historically speaking, that is the reason, not to serve and protect, but to get a job that would elevate their status in life. The issue is that it is a job that is deified to the point where there is no way to deal with the reality that the blue wall of silence and the lack of ability to prosecute cops creates a system where, despite how many good apples there are, it creates a systematic place of distrust within the very communities cops are trying to protect. It is inherently not good. Not great, Bob! Especially when there are so many examples of individual to large-scale police corruption. Which means it's time to get true crimey.
I cannot believe it's been 20 years. It has been a long, long journey.
One of the names I knew very early on in my life that defined the experience of black people in America with the police next to the beating of Rodney King was the shooting of Amadou Diallo. On February 4th, 1999, an unarmed 23-year-old Guinean immigrant named Amadou Diallo was fatally shot 41 times by 4 New York City Police Department plainclothes officers: Sheen Carroll, Richard Murphy, Edward McMillan, and Kenneth Boss. The officers were apparently looking for an alleged serial rapist, saw Diallo and ordered him to show his hands. He panicked, ran towards his door, reached into his pocket, and the officers fired. He was attempting to pull out his wallet from his pocket when he was shot. This was a huge moment in the national culture, and even artists made music about it. Artists like the 88 Keys, Bruce Springsteen, Wyclef Jean, and others all made songs referencing it. Yes, you guys, Bruce Springsteen is political. I'm sorry I have to break it to you like this. Also, the NYPD did refuse to actually provide him security because he wanted to perform that song. So, petty life. An internal NYP investigation ruled that the cops acted in what a reasonable police officer would have done. Of course, why 4 men shoot a man who could not escape 41 times continues to astound me personally, but I'm just a big-titted idiot. Diallo had committed no crime. He was not the serial rapist in question. Out of the 41 shots fired, 19 bullets had fatally struck Diallo. When the 4 officers searched Diallo's dead body for a weapon, they only found that wallet and a beeper. Apparently, when he realized that he had shot an unarmed civilian, Carroll cried, "Oh my God, please don't die." During the trial, the defense blamed Diallo for forcing the policemen to fire their guns, according to the Washington Post. If he had done what Carroll and McMillan told him to do and not run away, Diallo would still be alive, was their argument. Which of course ignores the fact that seeing a bunch of white men approach you and pull guns at you is a terrifying experience. Cops running up on you when you're just living your life is fucking scary, especially when they are in plain clothes and there is no preparation for the assault you're about to have on your psyche. I was walking in Park Slope minding my own black ass business, trying to go to a fucking Union Market, and I saw this plainclothes cop just like swoop in. It looked like a movie. The speed of which the car came and the police officers came out was literally, I was like at a loss for breath. Thankfully, I held in that fight or flight instinct to not run because I knew in the back of my mind from all of this true crime bullshit that if I run, there's an assumption of guilt on my part, even though I was not doing anything.
It was one of the first police-involved shootings in New York City that sparked national outrage and conversations about race and police relations.
On March 25th, 1999, a Bronx grand jury indicted the 4 officers on charges of second-degree murder and reckless endangerment. But after a very rare change of venue to Albany, New York, a jury composed of 4 black and 8 white jurors acquitted the officers of all charges. All I'm going to say about juries is that when people say a jury of your peers, Hell no. I do not want a jury of my peers deciding shit for me. I've seen you guys' tweet threads. No thank you. You are not my peers. I don't know you. Then President Bill Clinton commented on the Diallo verdict at a Democratic fundraiser in San Francisco, saying, "I don't pretend for a moment to second guess the jury, but I know most people in America of all races believe that if it had been a white man in an all-white neighborhood, it probably wouldn't have happened."
The Diallo family sued the city, and a $3 million settlement was reached. They started the Amadou Diallo Foundation with that money.
And also, after a federal investigation found discovering of racial profiling, gas, the Street Crimes Unit, which is what those men were a part of, was officially disbanded in 2002. And though the other 3 officers left the department over time, Boss remained on the force. Then in 2016, Boss, while working for the NYPD's aviation unit, was heralded as a hero by the Sergeants Benevolent Association and awarded with Sergeant of the Year. And Boss got to retire from the NYPD 3 years later with pension. So, but defund the police is a radical thing, right? But let's talk about something different. Let's talk about when cops just commit murder out of petty revenge.
Waive time and agree to continue your arraignment to July 6th this year.
Yes, Your Honor.
Oh boy. You guys, get ready for this. My true crime heads are probably very familiar with this case because I have heard maybe like 5 different podcasts about this because it's been extensively covered. Again, all the links below, but we're going to talk about the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. On February 24th, 1986, the body of Sherry Rasmussen was found beaten and shot 3 times in her apartment. The LAPD initially considered this case to be like a botched burglary because there were like radios and stuff strewn in the apartment. Everyone was like, oh, weird. And they weren't able to identify a suspect because there wasn't any relating prints. However, Sherry's father had an idea of who the murderer might be. LAPD officer Stephanie Lazarus, which, by the way, Lazarus is an amazing last name. I wish it wasn't attached to this terrible woman. Stephanie Lazarus had been in a, let's say, Jodi Arias-like relationship with a man named John Rutten, who would go on to become engaged and marry Sherry Rasmussen. Lazarus had been using her authority as a cop to stalk and intimidate Rasmussen. She would even come to see her with her uniform on, like holding her gun and shit. And I'm just like,
are you not ashamed of yourself? Are you not embarrassed?
And of course, Sherry was intimidated and afraid because who do you report a cop to? When Rasmussen was found dead in her apartment, all the signs pointed to a burglary. And although Sherry's father had his suspicions, Lazarus was seen as a star cop in her right. Not to mention, John Rutten was kind of dumb and didn't really know how bad things were and kind of oblivious to the situation. So when his wife was found dead, the lead detectives only really considered 2 possibilities. One, that John killed Sherry because most women are killed by their intimate partners, or 2, that she had been killed by some home intruders. And there were Latino men, of course, who were the first people that they were looking into to see of what happened because of the stacked stereo equipment that was left on the floor. There was actually a lot of evidence left on the crime scene, including a bite mark on Sherry's arm from the attack. Her father wanted this to be tested for DNA because duh, and even though this case happened in the 80s, in the 90s it became something that was used in cold cases to figure out stuff, so he wanted to do that. But he was told that the department had a limited budget and could not afford to run such tests. He offered to pay for the test himself, our dear old dad, because of course he would, but he was told that the DNA would do no good without a suspect. Then, dramatic hair flip. Then, on October 11th, 1993, a detective named Phil Morit had visited the LA County Coroner's Office and signed out all of the forensic samples that were there connected to this case that may have contained suspect DNA. Now, apparently, usually you would get this evidence at the request of an investigator, but there's no record of a request being made, and Morris would later tell the department investigators that he had no memory of citing out the samples. The evidence connecting this police officer to a murder just disappeared. Wow. Things that make you go, Rasmussen's murder would be a cold case for over 20 years. All the while, Lazarus would continue to rise in her police department. According to Vanity Fair, Lazarus had a reputation for being tenacious, tough, and strictly by the book. In fact, in all of her years in the department, she had never had a disciplinary hearing. Not one. Everyone knew her and couldn't help but like her despite her perfection. She was usually chipper and fun. She had married a fellow officer. She was one of those people whom it was simply a privilege to know. Now, things started to change in 2003 when someone found a misplaced swab from the case in a manila envelope that someone just left in the freezer for 18 years. The truth is stranger than fiction, my dudes. The truth is stranger than fiction. And inside this envelope that was 18 years old, could vote now, was a screw cap tube, and inside were 2 swabs. The lab test came back for this in 2005, and there were no hits. But they were able to confirm that the bite came from a female, so clock started ticking, and upon 4 more years of investigation, again guys, look at the timeline, they realized that the .38 caliber bullet that killed Sherry matched a gun that Lazarus lost. And when people finally took the connection between her and the victim seriously, they found a way to get her DNA, which is another reminder, don't throw shit away. That sounds mad hoarder, but literally they followed her to a Costco and they took one of the cups and straws that she used out of the garbage can, and like they fast-tracked that DNA, and it confirmed that the mouth on the straw, her mouth, was the same mouth that bit Sherry Rasmussen's forearm 23 years ago. 23 years this case was just in the freezer. The swab made the freezer blows minds.
The investigation in 1986 is a completely different story, and the family has numerous questions about what was done during that time period.
Finally, in 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of the murder of Sherry Rasmussen and was sentenced to 27 years in jail, which, good, but let's just remind ourselves, that is only a few more years than the amount of time that she was free. Like, that is cuckoo fucking bananas, okay? Cuckoo fucking bananas. How does this happen? How does this happen? They still don't know what happened to the missing evidence. They still don't know why it was in the freezer. They don't know. They don't want you to know. So we have talked about in this video so far, and we're still only on police, the killing of our own black folks and using the police system to kill someone for personal reasons. Now let's get into that big old corruption stuff. You know, that good old the shield shit.
Well, a former top Baltimore cop official who supervised the disgraced gun unit that stole from people and sold drugs onto the city streets says he had no idea about their crimes or the many internal affairs complaints against those officers.
I read a lot of books for this video, and one of them was We Own This City, a true story of crime, cops, and corruption by John Fenton. It explores how 8 police officers from the Baltimore Police Department, Elite, Gun Task Force, used their power to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, drugs, and jewelry from the criminals that they were supposed to be locking up in the streets. They were extorting drug dealers, cops, okay? The officers in this unit set people up for baseless searches. Basically, everything that people fear the police are doing, they were doing. The book is long and there's a lot of details we're gonna get into, but Vox provided a handy list that I shall read from now of these men's crimes. So let's break it down, shall we? The officers would allegedly drive fast at groups of people and quickly slam on the brakes, hoping to scare them to see who would take off running and therefore give pretense for a chase and search. This allegedly happened 10 to 20 times on slow nights and more than 50 on busier nights.
2011, when Jenkins' crew tried to rob 2 men in a car, causing them to flee, hitting and killing Albert Davis in northwest Baltimore.
The officers also allegedly used illegal GPS trackers to chase down targets for robbery. In July 2016, the officers allegedly picked up a married couple, even though there was no evidence of a crime, found out that the couple had $40,000 in a house outside of the city, and proceeded to scour the property for cash. They took $20,000 from this couple before they called other law enforcement to the home, arguing that they had uncovered actual criminal activity with no actual evidence of that. Here's another one. Officers took a man's house keys, found out where he lived through police databases, and went to his house where they found drugs and a safe. They allegedly took $100,000 from the safe, which had $2,000 inside. $200,000 inside, my bad, excuse me. Then they filmed themselves pretending to open the safe for the first time to cover up the crime, according to investigators. During the 2015 Baltimore riots over the police killing of Freddie Gray, one officer allegedly stopped a looting at a pharmacy only to take the stolen drugs himself, give them to a drug dealer, and split the proceeds. The cops once reportedly found a gun and 1.5 pounds of marijuana in an illegal warrantless search. Their solution, they sold the drugs and firearm back onto the streets. In total, the task force is suspected of stealing at least $300,000 in cash, 3 kilos of cocaine, 43 pounds of marijuana, 800 grams of heroin, and jewelry worth hundreds of thousands more in cash.
He said former Sergeant Wayne Jenkins ran his elite unit as a criminal gang. At least 10 armed robberies, burglaries, $1 million in drug sales, the systematic looting of overtime in a city that can barely afford it.
One cop allegedly took a month off to remodel his house and was still paid, and another claimed overtime while on vacation in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Nature is unhappy too, my loves. What I enjoy about the book itself is that it provides a lot of context for why these oversights were allowed to happen and the personal toll it took. It is a very good read. And basically the root of it is that Baltimore's murder rate, unlike most cities, rose in the past several years. The city reported about 343 killings in 2017, which brought it to a record high rate of 56 homicides per 100,000 people. So people wanted a strong police force to keep guns off the streets, and therefore they didn't want their cops to be, as one quoted as saying, a social worker with a gun. And this tough on crime approach was also reflected in the 2014 race to become top prosecutor, which brought one of my favorite lines from the book. So the race was between Marilyn Mosby and incumbent Greg Bernstein. Mosby claimed that she would be, and I quote, the next Malcolm X, MLK, and Farrakhan, all wrapped into one with dreads and preaching so the whole world can hear. She don't even have dreads. All three? You're gonna be all 3 of them in one. Locking up your old people. Okay. Her mother and father were both police officers. Her family traces its association with the police back for 2 generations, and her grandfather was one of the first African-American police officers in the state. So she was deep in it. And that was a big selling point for her as a candidate until the murder of Freddie Gray changed the climate of things in Baltimore. She prosecuted the cops, but they were acquitted because everyone believed that they were just doing their job. And one judge in the case against one of the cops said, they are in a high crime area. They're checking things out and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Convey my appreciation to the officers for doing their job, notwithstanding my decision. Love that for us. This is why we can't be free, because the whole fucking system is fucked. Anyway, these cops did horrible things, and in response to the death of Freddie Gray, continue to flout the corruption. You hate to see it. But they were seen as Vikings who were keeping the streets clean and delivering numbers. That meant they got to do what they wanted, so they did. The racial breakdown of these officers were that most of the people on this unit were black, but the leads, the detective and the 2 sergeants, were white. So even within this system, we see that having black officers does not inherently mean you have a fair police system, especially when they have white overseers and there is an internal bias against the system and talking about corruption within that blue wall of silence. It's all bullshit. This is why we talk about defunding the police and reallocating funds. It is bizarre to me that that is seen as more extreme when you look at what the history of policing has already done to communities. I think we are done with the police because honestly, the police are just the first step in a larger corrupt system. Let's move on to the criminal justice system prosecutor edition. Dun dun.
In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by 2 separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders.
Do you trust DNA? Forensic science? Special experts? Well, most people do. But despite the certainty that crime dramas have taught us to rely on, the reality is that forensic science and the techniques to use are constantly evolving, as they should, as all good science does. But this also means that scientists and medical officials are constantly figuring out the difference between real science and junk science. This includes things like eugenics, homophobic scientific studies that used to say that gay people were more likely to become pedophiles. All of that stuff is considered now junk science. And in the true crime world, there are a lot of things that used to be evidence and certainty that are now seen as arbitrary. The use of cadaver dogs, bite mark testing, fingerprint analysis, and even DNA itself can have issues depending on the testing. To simplify things, because there could be a lot in this section, we're going to touch on one of the biggest pieces of junk science: arson science. For years, there was an idea that the science around arson was pretty sound, yet there was very little science actually involved. According to the ABA Journal, most investigators whose job it was to catch arsonists were former police officers or firefighters with little or no scientific background. As a result, a lot of the science was based off of myths that people assumed about how fires worked. In 1977, the now defunct Law Enforcement Assistance Administration sought to collect arson expertise through a survey of fire investigators. But that did more harm than good, because the results were published in a booklet that presented many of the myths that people collected over time as fact. These myths were then cited and repeated in many other textbooks, which transformed all of these old wives' tales into facts. Thankfully, in the mid-80s, people began asking questions, and a document, the NFPA 920 Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations, first published in 1992 and periodically updated ever since, became the new fire investigators' Bible. Not only dispelled many of the myths fire investigators had long relied upon, but marked the beginning of a movement within the profession to apply scientific principles to fire investigations. Didn't happen until 1992. However, it meant that hundreds, if not thousands, of accidental fires had been wrongly determined to have been intentionally set. People were sent to jail, sent to death for arson that may have not happened. One of the cases that is often cited about this topic is Cameron Todd Williamson, a man who was convicted and executed for the murder of his 3 young children. Prosecutors claimed that Willingham killed his children in order to cover up child abuse, even though there was no evidence that any such abuse happened. The mother of his children defended Willingham, saying that although he was abusive towards her, that did not reflect his treatment of the children. The police came to the conclusion that the fire had been started using some sort of liquid accelerant after finding char patterns that they thought were in the shape of puddles. He was arrested, put on trial, and found guilty for these crimes because, again, in addition to all of this, he had been acting weirdly, and that is considered as good as guilty. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Willingham a right of habeas corpus a month before his execution. Willingham was executed by lethal injection February 17, 2004. Of course, the issue is that people believe that the science used to convict Willingham is bunk. And I'm sorry I keep pronouncing that name differently, I realize. I'm sorry. Fire investigator Gerald L. Hurst reviewed the case documents, including the trial transcript and an hour-long videotape of the aftermath of the fire scene. Hurst said in December 2004 that there is nothing to suggest to any reasonable arson investigator that this was an arson fire. It was just a fire. In August of 2009, 18 years after the fire and 5 years after Willingham's execution, a report conducted by Dr. Craig Baylor, hired by the Texas Forensic Science Commission to review the case, found that, quote, a finding of arson could not be sustained. Baylor said that the key testimony from a fire marshal at Willingham's trial was, quote, hardly consistent with a scientific mindset and more characteristic of mystics or psychics. That is fucking terrifying. Like, Cameron Todd Willingham may not have been a good guy, but that's not the fucking point. He was convicted on 3 counts of capital murder against his own fucking children and executed by the state on science that would likely not hold up today by someone whose testimony was seen as that of a psychic or a mystic. And what's worse it doesn't seem like things have changed. A recent survey of 217 fire investigators by a student from National University in San Diego found that only 14% had any advanced degree of any kind. 13% only had a high school education. And again, it's fine if they have the knowledge in some other way, but a 2013 survey of 586 public sector fire investigators by 2 Eastern Kentucky University professors found that some myths are still commonly believed to be indicators of arson. Be afraid, you guys. Be afraid. You are closer to getting caught up in this than you think. Not just of junk science, but also of the people who could be handling the science. Enter the Netflix documentary series, How to Fix a Drug Scandal, which I watched in one day because I was doing my hair and I was fucking horrified.
I actually smoked in the evidence room. I was totally controlled by my addiction.
How to Fix a Drug Scandal is an American true crime documentary miniseries that was released on Netflix on April of 2020. It is about drug crime lab chemists Sonia Farrak and Annie Dukin and their tampering with evidence. Okay? So Farrak and Dukin were 2 women in Massachusetts found to be writing fake drug results at their Massachusetts crime labs. And in it, you really get to see the relationship between the chemist and the police prosecutor. And that's something that we likely don't think about because we see science as impartial. But it ignores the human relationship between those 2 groups that would happen organically. In the documentary, it shows that Dukin would get praised for delivering the results that the prosecution wanted. Because when you think about it, those positive results trickle down to showing that the prosecution and the police are doing their job, prosecuting crimes, getting criminals off the street, getting drugs off the street. So you need it to be crack and not salt. When it comes to Dukin, in July 2011, an evidence officer at the lab discovered that Dukin had tested 95 samples without properly sending them out. This was seen as a severe red flag, and upon further investigation, it was revealed that she had forged the initials of an evidence officer in her logbook and was suspended from duties. Of course, she still testified in court up until next February. Dukin was then placed on leave and then eventually resigned in March of 2012. Following her resignation, the state police mounted a massive probe into Dukin, and it found that there were a lot of red flags with her that all of her superiors had ignored because she was giving them amazing results. Amazing fraudulent results. She had reportedly tested over 500 samples per month, 5 times the normal average, even though her supervisors and colleagues claimed to have never seen her in front of a microscope and that she frequently misidentified samples. The truth is scarier than fiction. Farrak, who worked at the state drug lab in Amherst, was arrested in 2013 for tampering with narcotic samples to feed her own addiction. And I'm not shaming her for this, but it is true. She was doing drugs on the job. In a statement, the ACLU said that Farrak had used drugs that she stole or manufactured in the Amherst lab for nearly 9 years. Her behavior caused thousands to be wrongfully convicted of drug crimes based on unreliable evidence. The Boston Globe says that a state probe found that she was smoking crack 10 to 12 times a day, including during work. She was doing drugs in the drug lab that would send people to jail for years for drug convictions. And she only got 18 months for this. Dukin is on parole right now after getting 3 years in jail. It is absurd. It's broken. It's broken. She was doing crack on the job, you guys. She was doing straight up crack on the job. She was making crack on the job. She was testing samples that could get people sent to jail while she was high on drugs for 9 years. And I'm glad that she has gotten help and again, I'm not shaming her for being a drug addict. It happens to people. I don't want to stigmatize it, but she was smoking crack while sending people to jail for doing crack. And pivoting away from this briefly, I found out about a woman named Joyce Gilchrist who worked more than 3,000 criminal cases in 21 years while working for the Oklahoma City Police Department as a forensic chemist. She was accused of falsifying evidence to help prosecutors, and throughout her work, her evidence led in part to 23 people being sentenced to death, 12 of whom have been executed.
She examines 3 cases that fell victim to questionable science, fabricated evidence, and false testimony in her series, Gilchrist, the damage done.
She consistently denied any wrongdoing and was never charged with any crime, even though her work sent at least 12 people to their death. I have never nairoed for a black woman this much in my life. And these are just 3 cases. We need to also take into account the role of the prosecutor in bringing things to trial. And that means getting into prosecutorial misconduct, where hopefully I will speak a little bit slower and not mess up all of my words. Law and Order has taught me that a prosecutor exists to speak for the city and the victims as designated by the law. According to the prosecution guidelines, the role of a prosecutor is to uphold justice, but politics and other factors often play a role in what ends up being prosecuted. They have choices, and that's why when people talk about the concept of a progressive prosecutor, they mean someone who won't prosecute marijuana charges, someone who will consider probation over jailing, someone who will try and make a deal that doesn't destroy the possible future of an individual. They also have more power in general than the typical defense attorney, especially a public defender, which gets countless cases in a day and often doesn't have the manpower to handle all of them. This makes it important that when their power leads to finding evidence that will lead to the innocence of someone they are prosecuting, they turn it over. This is called a Brady disclosure. In practice, this doctrine has been difficult to enforce. Some states have established their own laws that try to strengthen the enforcement of the prosecution, so it is hard to actually get this unless something seriously happens. In many ways, it is up to the prosecutor to decide the tenure of the court. People tend to trust the prosecution because they are seen as more neutral and on the side of justice, while a defense attorney is on the side of a client. Years of Law and Order have no doubt played into that mindset in the eyes of juries. But that doesn't account for what it means to have prosecutors who are completely at the mercy of the public. Not to mention that they can have their own biases that come into the courtroom. This can allow them to ignore evidence and criminalize people in order to prove that they are these heroic figures trying to protect their local town. Take the case of Curtis Flowers.
Prosecutors dropped all of the charges against a Mississippi man who had been tried 6 times for a quadruple murder.
Curtis Flowers is an African-American man who was tried for murder 6 times in the state of Mississippi. 4 of those trials resulted in convictions, all of which were overturned on appeal due to massive Brady violations. Flowers was alleged to have committed the July 16, 1996 shooting deaths of 4 people inside of Tardy Furniture, a store in Winona, Montgomery County. Flowers was first convicted in 1997, and in 5 of the 6 trials, the prosecutor, County District Attorney Doug Evans, sought the death penalty. He has tried to keep black jurors out of the jury pool. He has doggedly gone after Flowers. All of the subsequent murder trials were all overturned by the Mississippi Supreme Court for racial bias by the prosecutor and jury selection. And Curtis Flowers' 4th and 5th trials ended as mistrials. Then, ultimately, on July 18, 2010, a majority white jury in Flowers' 6th trial convicted him of the murders and voted to impose a death sentence.
How can a person be tried for the same crime 6 times?
This case is unprecedented in the history of the American legal system.
What brought an overwhelming amount of attention to this case was the podcast In the Dark, which is how I discovered this case and many others. It discussed the holes, the reason why it was overturned, the other possible, perpetrators of the crime, and basically set up a really great defense for the issue. And it also very much highlighted the Jim Crow levels of race issues still going on in Winona, Mississippi. This podcast and What It Unearthed played a huge role in the case being brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, which is something that does not often get to happen in cases like this. Even Supreme Court Justice Brett I Love Beer Kavanaugh voiced concerns that Flowers' most recent conviction was tainted, considering Evans' other violations of constitutional rights in the Flowers case. Even Clarence fucking Thomas spoke during this trial, and Clarence Thomas does not speak. The decision, Flowers versus Mississippi, was done with a majority, and conservative Brett Kavanaugh wrote the majority opinion, that 7-2 opinion. And then finally in December of that year, Flowers was released from prison for the first time since his original arrest, and it was up to the state to decide if they were going to prosecute him again. And then finally, September 4th of 2020, Mississippi Attorney General Lynn Fitch, a Republican who had taken over the case from Evans, announced that she would not seek a 7 trial and drop charges against Flowers, bringing an end to his nightmare. I mean, he didn't even get to see his mother pass away. He didn't get to hold his parents for years. Imagine not being able to hold your mother for decades, and then having her die and not being able to even get a furlough to say goodbye to her. Curtis Flowers is finally free, but out of fear of racial retribution from the majority white people who still think he is guilty, Flowers can't even freely go back to Winona, which is where his father lives. There are no other leads in the case that look like they're going to be pursued, so that means that the victims will likely never know justice and continue to blame the media for getting involved in their case, because if it wasn't for that, they would still have their perfect scapegoat. And if it wasn't for the media, that true crime podcast, many of us may have never heard of it, and Curtis Flowers might still be in prison on death row. That is how fragile our system is, that literally these podcasts, some of which are dubious and many of them are not, are what is keeping people out of prison, or at least asking us as an audience to consider what gets people put into prisons. Never a jury of my peers, because I am not doing that. No.
You don't look back at prior cases and think, well, maybe there had been a problem on this. I'm trying to go to the question's point about whether there are innocent people who found themselves on death row. You believe that the system is working sufficiently?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
What is the point of prison? Prison reform is something that both sides of the aisle have talked about for decades, especially following the relitigation around things like stop and frisk, the war on drugs, and the slow decriminalization of marijuana, which there are still many people in jail for, considering it is legal in most places. Thanks, Nixon. Yet when we talk about prison abolition, just like with the funding of the police, it is seen as extreme because where will all the bad people go? Let's start off by saying that prisons are not and have never been a deterrent for crime. We have the largest prison population in the world, and according to the World Population Review, still have the 50th highest crime rate out of 132 countries. Not great, Bob. Not great for the numbers that we're putting in. The purpose of prison, and if it was a good thing, if it is a good thing, has been a subject for debate for literally centuries, because allowing people to waste away in dehumanizing conditions is generally not seen as a great thing to do to the human body, mind, or spirit. Yet, when people become afraid, they want to believe in a clear separation between themselves and the criminal element. Well, in Michel Foucault's, yes, I read this, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, he states, prison in its reality and visible effects was denounced at once as the great failure of the penal system. This discourse started happening in the 1800s. Let me show you, because I made notes. So what were the points that they were making in the 1800s about prison reform, according to our good old boy, Michel? Let's go into it. And you know this is good for me, because you know I don't respect the French, but like, Foucault's pretty poppin'. An argument made in La Fraternité, February 1842. Prisons do not diminish the crime rate. They can be extended, multiplied, or transformed. The quantity of crime and criminals remains stable or worse, increases. The number of crimes is not diminishing. The number of recidivists is increasing rather than declining. Next, we have this. Detention causes recidivism. Those leaving prison have more chance than before of going back to it. Convicts are, in a very high proportion, former inmates. 38% of those who left the Maisons Centrales were convicted again, and 33% of those sent to convict ships between 1828 and 1834, out of almost 35,000 convicted of crime, about 7,400 were recidivists. Out of over 200,000 correctionals or petty offenders, almost 35,000 were also recidivists. So basically what you can see is that there's a lot of recidivism and it's not really affecting the girls the way they want to. The next point, the prison cannot fail to produce delinquents. It does so by the very type of existence that it imposes on its inmates, whether they are isolated in cells or whether they are given useless work for which they will find no employment. It is, in any case, not to think of man in society. It is to create an unnatural, useless, and dangerous existence. The prison also produces delinquents by imposing violent constraints on its inmates. It is supposed to apply the law, to teach respect for it, but all its functioning operates in form of an abuse of power, the arbitrary power of administration. Quote, the feeling of injustice that a prisoner has is one of the causes that may make his character untamable. Next, going on to the next point that they have, and again, 1842. Okay, next point. The prison makes possible, even encourages, the organization of a milieu of delinquents loyal to one another, hierarchized, ready to aid and abet any future criminal acts. Gangs. They told us. Next one. The conditions to which the free inmates are subjected necessarily condemns them to recidivism. They are under the surveillance of the police. They are assigned to a particular residence or forbidden others. They leave prison with a passport that they must show everywhere they go, which mentions the sentence that they have served. Y'all seen Les Miserables? This is the shit they was talking about. That's why he had to be like, no, I gotta hide this shit. Let me get the silverware, girl. Lastly, very important, the prison indirectly produces delinquents by throwing the inmate's family into destitution. The same order that sends the head of the family to prison reduces each day the mother to destitution, the children to abandonment, the whole family to vagabondage and begging. It is in this way that crime can take root. 1842. People have been saying and making the point that sending people to prison helps nobody. It does not help the families that are left behind. It doesn't make them better people, and it encourages other criminal behavior. They've been saying it. And Michel put it all together for us. They just wrote it in a book that we don't read until grad school. That's how they get us. But it's okay. I'm bringing it to you. I Foucault to you. Angela Davis says in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, which is more like a long essay, the prison industrial complex is much more than the sum of all the jails and prisons in the country. It is a set of symbiotic relationships among correctional communities, transnational corporations, media conglomerates, guards unions, and legislative and court agendas. If it is true that the contemporary meaning of punishment is fashioned through these relationships, then the most effective abolitionist strategies will contest these relationships and propose alternatives that pull them apart. What we have created in the prison system is not healthy or helpful to society. From the mid-1800s to today, we are having the exact same conversation about prisons, yet we still think that prisons keep people safe. Yet there is horrible sexual abuse and criminal activity that has been allowed to foster in prisons that helps to promote the recidivism that we see being told and is mentioned in Foucault and in modern day. In all too familiar sexual abuse of women in U.S. state prisons, it reveals the extent to which women's prison environments are violently sexualized. They found that in the course of committing such gross misconduct, male officers have not only used actual or threatened physical force, but have also used their near total authority to provide or deny goods and privileges to female prisoners, to comply them to have sex, or in other cases to reward them for having done so. In other cases, male officers have violated their most basic professional duty. In addition to engaging in sexual relations with prisoners, male officers have used mandatory pat-down frisks or room searches to grope women's breasts, buttocks, and vaginal areas, and to view them inappropriately while in a state of undress in the housing or bathroom areas. A lot of women in prisons have been victims of sexual assault and sexual trauma. You are re-traumatizing women in prison. Not to mention that prison rape is why statistically the rates of male sexual abuse survivors is much higher than what we usually have. It is underreported. Yet people joke about not dropping the soap or that certain types of criminals get raped in jail, which feeds our revenge desires that go all the way back to the breads and circuses and hangings. That's the same inclination. It is the same desire to see people who we have decided deserve to be punished deal with this. But let's look at the fact. There are people in prison who are innocent. B, there are people in jail and housed in prison for not having enough money to get bail for their trials. C, the majority of people in prison right now are not rapists and murderers, which means that they are forced to engage with even more criminal activity and create the same bonds that people are talking about in this book. This isn't even touching the juvenile system, which is equally as fucked up and has situations where they don't even have mandatory minimums, so judges can make whatever arbitrary decisions that they want. I'm not going to get too deeply into this section because there's a lot of literature about prison abolition that you can go to as a resource, but considering all the things that I've talked about in this video, on top of the fact that we criminalize homelessness, that the largest inpatient psychiatric facilities in the United States are the LA County Jail, New York's Rikers Island, and Chicago's Cook County Jail, the amount of people with mental illnesses in jail and prisons outnumbers those in state hospitals 10-1, and we allow it to remain broken because we believe our safety has to come at the result of someone else's loss of rights, because we have been fed this paranoia that there are serial killer Jeffrey Dahmers around every corner and that we have to stop them. And the reality is that is not the case. Are there Jeffrey Dahmers out there? Who the fuck knows? The one Jeffrey Dahmer we have is dead. There are not that many serial killers out there. That's why the same documentaries are always happening. Why are we having so many tapes? Where do you keep getting the tapes from? Well, this has been a bummer of sorts. Moscow Mule, I love you very much. I don't want to end this video on a totally bland note because that's not the kind of channel I want to be. I know people go back and forth about if true crime is exploitative or not. I don't think it's a black and white issue. I mean, overall things aren't dipping cloth in the blood of Bonnie and Clyde bad, but with the rise of armchair detectives and people using this as a basis for a whole career, I can see how this makes people feel uneasy. But personally, true crime has just always been a part of my life. I used to watch Snapped with my mom and crime shows like Columbo and Perry Mason, which are not true crime, but they're crime shows. But you know what I mean. And it's always filled me with a greater sense of justice. I mean, I watched 12 Angry Men at a very delicate age, and I have literally wanted to be a Henry Fonda in a case one day. Like, I cannot wait to be on jury duty. And this always interests me because humans are complex, messy apes, and true crime is just a part of our history. It can be off-putting to laugh at it, but honestly, laughing to stop from crying is sometimes very necessary. That's why I don't understand why people are critical of Amanda Knox for like making jokes about her experience. She's never making fun of Meredith. She's making fun of her experience being locked up. Let Amanda Knox do what she wants. She's innocent. That's the most important thing. She didn't kill anyone, but she still went to jail. She can make jokes. She can make jokes. And really, in the end, it kind of all depends on your level. I love the podcast Let's Go to Court because I love the way that Karen and Brandy talk to each other. They feel like genuine friends. I can like listen to their podcast over and over again. I enjoy the humor that they bring to it while also being very much on the side of the victim and just being very candid. I enjoy the dryness of Case File because I think they do a really good job of diligently going through the facts. I enjoy the frat boy humor of Last Podcast on the Left because at least they put their money where their mouth is and they've grown and they've evolved. I'll never be an apologist for them, but I enjoy their stuff and I always feel like I'm learning something through listening to them. I love the mellow fury of Southern Fried true crime. I think that they're excellent. I think the host is excellent and fun, and she worships Dolly, and so do we. Even today, I just was listening to Crime Show, and they had a fantastic episode about a judicial court, a juvenile system court in Pennsylvania, where the judge was taking money from these juvenile detention camps and putting all of these kids in juvie for these minor things. These are things that we should know. It has always been fundamental in making me realize that we have been totally warped by Leonardo & Co. Skip Intro, who's another YouTuber, has a great series on propaganda. Highly recommended it. They're so well done. I don't know how he doesn't have more views. He has amazing quality. Like, honestly, you should watch him instead of me. I'm not gonna lie. But he's great, and it talks about how we learn about the police through these shows and the way that we have been taught to believe that things like asking for a lawyer is a confession of guilt, or that defense attorneys are all slimy scumbags. We have genuinely been taught to believe stomping on our rights is okay because this group of cops means well. But a lot of the times, if you're actually watching the show, it will tell on itself. SVU especially. The detectives are almost always wrong and ruining lives with their gut feelings and their hunches. And it's just like, guys, your hunch is not evidence. Meanwhile, having no sense of care for the actual sex workers or vulnerable populations that they police, especially in the earlier seasons, because I only watched the Benson Stabler seasons. I'm sorry, I know. I like their chemistry, okay? Daddy's back. In the episode Fallacy from season 4, episode 21, with Catherine Moonigan playing Moaning? Shane from the L Word playing a trans woman going to jail for murdering someone, the only person using the correct language to talk about her is her defense attorney, the lawyer that everyone dismisses as being out for himself. The way he was portrayed more than any of the weird actual use of slurs, which is still very cringe to hear even though it's a product of its time, says a lot about the politics of the show. It sets us, the audience, up to distrust people trying to keep us out of jail. We keep thinking that diversity will change things, but the sad reality is that it doesn't. In his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Locking Up Our Own, James Foreman Jr. opens it up with a young black boy being in a courtroom with a black judge, black bailiff, prosecutor, and defense attorney. The judge, in response to the boy's relatively minor crimes, and they're not innocent but minor crimes, gives him what Foreman calls the Dr. King speech, which in part goes, well, let me tell you, Dr. King didn't march and die so you could be a fool, so that you could be out on the streets getting high, carrying a gun, and robbing people. No, young man, that was not his dream. That was not his dream at all. And I'm sure many black people have heard that speech. And the reality is, for many black people in the 70s and 80s, they wanted to put black criminals in jail because they wanted them out of their communities. They were already struggling enough. They didn't want to deal with that. And that sadly led to all the tough on crime policies that we are now dealing with as this generation. To many African American observers, the revolving door was discriminatory. It spun fastest for the criminals who victimized blacks. Quote, the poor and the uninformed are easy to prey upon, and the courts don't give a damn about the victims, wrote Carl Rowan, one of the nation's most prominent African American columnists, in a piece titled, Locking Up Thugs is Not Vindictive. What's more is that Foreman says that after 40 years of tough on crime tactics with their toll on the black American community, 64% of African Americans still thought the courts were not harsh enough. Which raises the question, what does harsh enough even mean? What are we actually using the courts to do? And sadly, getting black officers as police officers, even though it was brought up on every single candidate talking about police reform, it is not, I repeat, it is not an automatic fix. Another thing from Foreman, because his book is honestly really excellent, highly recommend. When Nicholas Alex interviewed hundreds of NYPD officers in 1964 and 1965, they couldn't have been clearer about their motivations. Police work was a good job, stable, secure, with good benefits, and most blacks chose it for that reason. One black officer told Alex, I was broke. I can't honestly recall any grandiose dreams of being a big fellow in blue. Another said, I looked around for the highest paying non-professional civil service job available. I took the test for the police, fire, sanitation, and corrections. I passed all the tests and the police was the first one I called for. So what can we do in the face of all of this? We can be aware and we can do our part to start undoing things. Part of what's important about true crime is that a lot of laws are made in response to these offshoot huge cases. I mean, just take Columbine. Most people react to the myth of Columbine and the actual facts of what those two perpetrators were doing. They were Nazis. They were not bullies. They were not victims. Yet that whole trenchcoat mafia bullshit is still echoing in our collective consciousness because that's what we were told. It was through listening to the last podcast on the left, true crime episodes on Columbine, that I actually went and did my own research and found out that was not the case. You know, how many laws are passed because one white child tragically was killed, and now we have all these trickle-down policies that impact our communities in really outrageous ways. We have to be more conscious of what it means when we ask for order in our society, and we have to be aware of what actually can work for us as citizens to protect ourselves and our communities. It's not easy, and I'm not even saying that it's always fair, but the reality is that locking up our own isn't working. Adding more police officers that look like us isn't working. These things aren't working because there are systematic things involved that make it harmful. And if you're listening to true crime and you're listening to it constructively and you're not being a voyeur, you are seeing that, you are hearing that, you are aware that things need to change on a deeper level than just lock them up. So what are some things that you guys can be aware of and that I'm going to gift to you today? A little bit of my good old Princess DA attorney, defense attorney, not district attorney, get it right, knowledge that I have picked up over my years of true crime. I'm not saying it'll keep you out of trouble entirely, but I am saying it's based on my reality. And I would do all of these things. So, and no, this is not a Harry Potter one, it's from Magic the Gathering. Totally different. Always get a lawyer. Do not speak to the police without a lawyer. Ever. Ever, 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 ever. You may think, I'm innocent, I didn't do anything. That's how they get you. The police can lie to you. Do not forget this very important fact. The police can lie to you. They can manipulate you. They are under no requirements to tell you the truth. And anything you say to try to protect yourself, say that you cheat on your wife, you're an adulterer, hate you, and then your wife dies, right? And you're like, I can't let them know I was having an affair. It's gonna make me a suspect. So you lie. Mistake. No. Now you're guilty. Now you're guilty. You know why you did that? You didn't talk to a lawyer. Because a lawyer would have told you, all right, what do we need to know? What do they need to know? What's the things that you gotta look at? Tell them what they need to know. An affair does not mean a murderer. Get your lawyer. Talk to your lawyer. Be honest with your lawyer. You need someone to be an advocate for you in trial. The prosecutor is not. The police are not in general. Polygraph tests are bunk. Stop taking them. Stop taking them as creed for anything. They don't mean shit. You can fake it. You can cheat a lie detector test. If they ask you to take a polygraph test without your lawyer present, don't do it. Also, don't give them no DNA randomly. Don't be drinking their coffee. That's how they get your DNA. That's how they get you. Because once you give it away, you give it away for free. Don't go nowhere with them with no lawyer. Don't answer no questions. Don't take no polygraph test unless you've consulted with your lawyer first, so that you know what you're getting into. Because if you're nervous and you're anxious, it'll affect the polygraph test because it takes up a bunch of stuff. Is it good when you pass it? Yeah. Does failing it actually mean anything? No. So don't do it unless your lawyer tells you to do so and you've already spoken with them about stuff. But don't just be like, I'll take a polygraph test. It means nothing. They're trying to psych you out. And if they ask you for a polygraph test before they've read your Miranda rights, especially go get a lawyer. Don't talk to them. But if you got tricked, if you get caught up and they're like, why don't you take a polygraph test? Lawyer. My true crime girlies already know. Y'all know. Check your life insurance. If your significant other starts suddenly getting attractive, getting their life together, but they're being distant from you, they don't actually feel invested in you, they don't want to make love anymore. They're on their phone all the time. By the way, everyone, a burner phone. If you're going to have a burner phone to cheat on your spouse, I'm not telling you to do so, but I am telling you this. Please don't tell people about it. The burner phone should be for you and the mistress. You don't want, and you should probably get a burner phone for you and the mistress so that if push comes to shove, you just break that shit in half. Stop thinking that your data can't be tracked. Stop it. Don't be telling people about your affairs either. Stupid. Anyway, check your life insurance policy. Has it been updated for some weird reason? Why are you, a 30-something-year-old person, paying so much in life insurance? Why is the premiums and what the payouts are so high? Check. Also, bitter almond. If you take something, if something smells like almonds that shouldn't smell like almonds, that's poison. That's arsenic. Run, girl. Run. Don't get caught. Don't sign no random paperwork either. I don't care if it's your spouse and you love them, everything. If they want you to sign paperwork, take it to a lawyer. And finally, this is my thing that I have to tell y'all. For when y'all on jury duty, being weird is not a crime. There are so many things that when you listen to jurors talk about their decisions, they talk about like, they didn't take the stand. You don't have to take the stand. It's actually better if you don't. Most people cannot handle going up on stand and being damn, the word is escaping right now. They can't be chat back. Can't do it. Stop. Don't do it. So if someone's being weird, it's not a crime. If people don't cry, this is a big one. Especially women who are accused of murdering somebody. If they don't cry, I'm like, why didn't she cry? They're being told not to cry. They're being told to be composed. Because if you're too composed, but if you're too composed, that's bad. If you're too weepy, that's also bad. So you're pretty much trapped. So I need jurors to understand that being weird is not a crime. You have to look at the evidence. And if people are saying, like with my girl Amanda, my sweet white queen Amanda, they're like, she was making out with her boyfriend. She gave him 2 pecks on the lip. And here's the thing, some people after death are horny also. Like, who cares? She didn't kill him. Being weird is not a crime. Stop sending people to prison because you don't like the color of their jib. It's not a smart way of thinking. Yes, there's common sense stuff, but there's also just people assuming that there is one way to grieve, one way to react to trauma, and there isn't. And when we perpetuate those ideas, we are sending people into jail based on our gut assumption and not by actual evidence. The amount of time I have heard cases on my, especially Let's Go to Court, love them. The amount of times I listen to people who like get sent to jail for murder with like no evidence really, but they just don't look right. Don't ever give me no jury of my peers. I don't trust y'all unless I'm Clarkeisha. She can be on my jury. Valerie, she can be on my jury. Danny Fernandez can be on my jury. Cheyenne, she can be on my thing. Rachel Leishman, she can be on my jury. Okay. My homegirl Shay, BKR can be on my jury pool. Natalie can be in my jury pool. Well, they probably would not let her because she's an abolitionist. But if I could have her, I would. Sarah's Canadian, so she can't be in my jury pool. But you get what I'm saying, right? For Harriet can be in my jury pool. Julesy can be in my jury pool. Those are my peers. I want them. Like, can you go on BreadTube and just drag all the bitches to Kings County and just get them here? Because I don't trust you guys. Y'all will send me to jail because I will not. I will be indignant. I will be on the prison like I'll have to be like, why did you plead the fifth? So I had to say shit to you. Why did you ask for a lawyer? Because I didn't do nothing. Because it's my rights. I have the right to say not a goddamn thing. And so do you. If you like this video, I had literally 4 sips of Moscow Mule. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. It does make a difference. It is very helpful. It gives me, endorphins. And I have been working really hard to get you some good content. I am so happy to be doing this stuff. I'm happy to be back. I can't wait. Next video is going to be a little bit of a black deep dive, and then in 2 or 3 weeks you get to actually hear me talk about the Snyder Cut. I know the thing that you've really wanted me to discuss, a whole me. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I have the resources and links all down below to any books and articles that I may have quoted or referenced during the course of this video. I would love to hear your guys' opinions. I know this is a topic that is very intense, but I hope that you guys will enjoy it. Oh, also the BuzzFeed Unsolved boys, Shane Madej and Ryan Bagara can be on my jury pool any day. They're so cute. I'm so sad they're leaving. the true crime stuff unsolved. But they're doing supernatural stuff, so I'll watch that. But I love them. They can be on my jury pool. If they sent me to jail, I'd be sad, but I'd be like, they must have had their reason. Have a good one, and bibbidi bobbidi, don't talk to the police! Did I kill my ex-boyfriend's girlfriend? Me? I'm sorry.